you have given a set of lectures on Nietzsche as part of the new Peterson Academy, and the lectures were powerful. There's some element of the contradictions, the tensions, the drama, the way you like lock in on an idea, but then are struggling with that idea. All of that feels like it's a Nietzschean.
Yeah, well, he's a big influence on me stylistically and like in terms of the way I approached writing. And also many of the people that were other influences of mine were very influenced by him. So I was blown away when I first came across his writings. They're so intellectually dense that I don't know if there's anything that approximates that. Dostoevsky, maybe, although he's much more wordy. Nietzsche is very succinct, partly because he was so ill, because he would think all day. He couldn't spend a lot of time writing, and he condensed his writings into very short, this aphoristic style he had, and it's really something to strive for. And then he's also an exciting writer, like Dostoevsky, and dynamic and romantic in that emotional way. And so it's really something. And I really enjoyed I did that lecture that you described. That lecture series is on the first half of Beyond Good and Evil, which is a stunning book. And that was really fun to take pieces of it and then to describe what they mean and how they've echoed across the decades since he wrote them. And yeah, it's been great.
Taking each sentence seriously and deconstructing it and really struggling with it. I think underpinning that approach to writing requires deep respect for the person. I think if we approach writing with that kind of respect, you can take Orwell, you can take a lot of writers and really dig in on singular sentences.
Yeah, well, those are the great writers, because the greatest writers, virtually everything they wrote is worth attending to. And I think Nietzsche is in some ways the ultimate exemplar of that, because often when I read a book, I'll mark one way or another. I often fold the corner of the page over to indicate something that I've found that's worth remembering. I couldn't do that with a book like Beyond Good and Evil, because every page ends up marked. And that's in marked contrast, so to speak, to many of the books I read now, where it's quite frequently now that I'll read a book and there won't be an idea in it that I haven't come across before. And with a thinker like Nietzsche, that's just not the case at the sentence level. And I don't think there's anyone that I know of who did that to a greater extent than he did. So there's other people whose thought is of equivalent value. I've returned recently, and I'm going to do a course to the work of this Romanian historian of religions, Mircea Eliade, who's not nearly as well known as he should be, and whose work, by the way, is a real antidote to the postmodern, nihilistic, Marxist stream of literary interpretation that the universities as a whole have adopted. And Eliade is like that too. I used this book called The Sacred and the Profane quite extensively in a book that I'm releasing in mid-November, We Who Wrestle with God, and it's of the same sort. It's endlessly analyzable. Eliade walked through the whole history of religious ideas, and he had the intellect that enabled him to do that, and everything he wrote is dreamlike in its density. So every sentence or paragraph is evocative in an image-rich manner, and that also, deepens and broadens the scope. And that's part of often what distinguishes writing that has a literary end from writing that's more merely technical. Like the literary writings have this imagistic and dreamlike reference space around them. And it takes a long time to turn a complex image into something semantic. And so if your writing evokes deep imagery, it has a depth that can't be captured merely in words. And the great romantic poetic philosophers, Nietzsche is a very good example, Dostoevsky is a good example, so is Mircea Eliade. They have that quality. And it's a good way of thinking about it. It's kind of interesting from the perspective of technical analysis of intelligence. There's a good book called The User Illusion, which is the best book on consciousness that I ever read. It explains the manner in which our communication is understandable in this manner. So imagine that when you're communicating something, you're trying to change the way that your target audience perceives and acts in the world. So that's an embodied issue. But you're using words which aren't when obviously aren't equivalent to the actions themselves. You can imagine that the words are surrounded by a cloud of images that they evoke, and that the images can be translated into actions. Yeah, and the greatest writing uses words in a manner that evokes images that profoundly affects perception and action. And so I would take the manner in which I act and behave, I would translate that into a set of images. My dreams do that for me, for example. Then I compress them into words. I toss you the words, you decompose them, decompress them into the images and then into the actions. And that's what happens in a meaningful conversation. It's a very good way of understanding how we communicate linguistically.
So if the words spring to the full visual complexity, and then that can then transform itself into action.
Yeah.
That's
and change in perception. Because
change in perception.
Well,
yeah.
Those are both relevant, and it's an important thing to understand, because the classic empiricists make the presumption, and it's an erroneous presumption, that perception is a value-free enterprise. And they assume that partly because they think of perception as something passive. You just turn your head and you look at the world and there it is. It's like, perception is not passive. There is no perception without action, ever, ever. And that's a weird thing to understand, because even when you're looking at something, like your eyes are moving back and forth, if they ever stop moving for a tenth of a second, you stop being able to see. So your eyes are jiggling back and forth just to keep them active. And then there's involuntary movements of your eyes. And then there's voluntary movements of your eyes. Like, what you're doing with your eyes is very much like what a blind person would do if they were feeling out the contours of an object. You're sampling, and you're only sampling a small element of the space that's in front of you. And the element that you choose to sample is dependent on your aims and your goals. So it's value saturated. And so all your perceptions are action predicated. And partly what you're doing when you're communicating is therefore not only changing people's actions, let's say, but you're also changing the strategy that they use to perceive. And so you change the way the world reveals itself for them. See, this is why it's such a profound experience to read a particularly deep thinker, because you could also think of your perceptions as the axioms of your thought. That's a good way of thinking about it. A perception is like what would you say? It's a thought that's so set in concrete that you now see it rather than conceptualize it. A really profound thinker changes the way you perceive the world. That's way deeper than just how you think about it or how you feel about it.
What about not just profound thinkers, but thinkers that deliver a powerful idea? For example, utopian ideas of Marx, or utopian ideas, you could say dystopian ideas of Hitler. Those ideas are powerful, and they can saturate all your perception with values, and they focus you in a way where there's only a certain set of actions.
Yeah, right. Even a certain set of emotions as well.
And it's intense and it's direct, and they're so powerful that they completely alter the perception, and the words spring to life.
Yeah, it's like a form of possession. So there's two things you need to understand to make that clear. The first issue is that, as we suggested or implied, that perception is action predicated, but action is goal predicated, right? You act towards a goal. And these propagandistic thinkers that you described, they attempt to unify all possible goals into a coherent singularity. And there's advantages of that. There's the advantage of simplicity, for example, which is a major advantage. And there's also the advantage of motivation, right? So if you provide people with a simple manner of integrating all their actions, you decrease their anxiety and you increase their motivation. Now, that can be a good thing if the unifying idea that you put forward is valid, but it's the worst of all possible ideas if you put forward an invalid unifying idea. And then you might say, well, how do you distinguish between a valid unifying idea and an invalid unifying idea? Now, Nietzsche was very interested in that, and I don't think he got that exactly right. But the postmodernists, for example, especially the ones, and this is most of them with the neo-Marxist bent, their presumption is that the fundamental unifying idea is power, that everything's about compulsion and force, essentially, and that that's the only true unifying ethos of mankind, which is, I don't know if there's a worse idea than that. I mean, there are ideas that are potentially as dangerous. The nihilistic idea is pretty dangerous, although it's more of a disintegrating notion than a unifying idea. The hedonistic idea that you live for pleasure, for example, that's also very dangerous. But if you wanted to go for sheer pathology, the notion that, and this is Foucault in a nutshell, and Marx for that matter, that power rules everything, not only is that a terrible unifying idea, but it fully justifies your own use of power. And I don't mean the power Nietzsche talks about. His will to power was more his insistence that a human being is an expression of will rather than a mechanism of self-protection and security. Like, he thought of the life force in human beings as something that strived not to protect itself, but to exhaust itself in being and becoming. It's like an upward oriented motivational drive, even towards meaning. Now, he called it the will to power, and that had some unfortunate consequences. At least that's how it's translated. But he didn't mean the power motivation that people like Foucault or Marx became so hung up on.
So it's not power like you're trying to destroy the other. It's power, full flourishing of a human being, the creative force of a human being.
Yeah.
In that
Well,
way. You
could imagine that, and you could imagine that you could segregate competence and ability. Like, imagine that you and I were going to work on a project. We could organize our project in relationship to the ambition that we wanted to attain, and we can organize an agreement so that you were committed to the project voluntarily, and so that I was committed to the project voluntarily. So that means that we would actually be united in our perceptions and our actions by the motivation of something approximating voluntary play. Now, you could also imagine another situation where I said, here's our goal, and you better help me or I'm going to kill your family. Well, the probability is that you would be quite motivated to undertake my bidding. And so then you might say, well, that's how the world works. It's power and compulsion. But the truth of the matter is that you can force people to see things your way, let's say, but it's nowhere near as good a strategy, even practically, than the strategy that would be associated with something like voluntary joint agreement of pattern of movement strategy towards a goal. See, this is such an important thing to understand because it helps you start to understand the distinction between a unifying force that's based on power and compulsion and one that is much more in keeping, I would say, with the ethos that governs Western societies, free Western societies. There's really a qualitative difference, and it's not some morally relativistic illusion.
So if we just look at the nuance of Nietzsche's thought, the idea he first introduced, and thus spoke Zarathustra, of the Übermensch.
Yeah.
It's another one that's very easy to misinterpret because it sounds awfully a lot like it's about power.
Yeah, right.
For example, in the 20th century, it was misrepresented and co-opted by Hitler to advocate for the extermination of the inferior non-Aryan races.
Yeah, and the dominion of the superior Aryans. Yeah, and that was partly because Nietzsche's work also was misrepresented by his sister after his death. Yeah. But I also think that there's a fundamental flaw in that Nietzschean conceptualization. So Nietzsche, of course, famously announced the death of God, but he did that in a manner that was accompanied by dire warnings, like Nietzsche said, because people tend to think of that as a triumphalist statement. But Nietzsche actually said that he really said something like the unifying ethos under which we've organized ourselves psychologically and socially has now been fatally undermined by the rationalist proclivity, by the empiricist proclivity. There's a variety of reasons. Mostly it was conflict between the Enlightenment view, let's say, and the classic religious view, and that there will be dire consequences for that. And Nietzsche knew, like Dostoevsky knew, that, there's a proclivity for the human psyche and for human societies to move towards something approximating a unity, because the cost of disunity is high. Fractionation of your goals, so that means you're less motivated to move forward than you might be because there's many things competing for your attention, and also anxiety, because anxiety actually signals something like goal conflict. So there's an inescapable proclivity of value systems to unite. Now, if you kill the thing that's uniting them, that's the death of God, they either fractionate and you get confusion, anxiety, and hopelessness, or you get social disunity, and you get social disunity, or something else arises out of the abyss to constitute that unifying force. And Nietzsche said specifically that he believed that one of those manifestations would be that of communism, and that would kill, he said this in Will to Power, that would kill tens of millions of people in the upcoming 20th century. Like he could see that coming 50 years earlier. And Dostoevsky did the same thing in his book, The Demons. So this is the thing that the a-religious have to contend with. It's a real conundrum because, I mean, you could dispute the idea that our value systems tend towards a unity, and society does as well, because otherwise we're disunified. But the cost of that disunity, as I said, is goal confusion, anxiety, and hopelessness. So it's like a real cost. So you could dispense with the notion of unity altogether, and the postmodernists did that to some degree. But they pulled off a sleight of hand too, where they replaced it by power. Now Nietzsche he's responsible for that to some degree, because Nietzsche said, with his conception of the overman, let's say, is that human beings would have to create their own values, because the value structure that had descended from on high was now shunted aside. But there's a major problem with that. Many major problems. The psychoanalysts were the first people who really figured this out after Nietzsche, because imagine that we don't have a relationship with the transcendental anymore that orients us. Okay, now we have to turn to ourselves. Okay, now if we were a unity, a clear unity within ourselves, let's say, then we could turn to ourselves for that discovery. But if we're a fractionated plurality internally, then when we turn to ourselves, we turn to a fractionated plurality. Well, that was Freud's observation. It's like, well, how can you make your own values when you're not the master in your own house? Like you're a war of competing motivations. Or maybe you're someone who's dominated by the will to force and compulsion. And so why do you think that you can rely on yourself as the source of values? And why do you think you're wise enough to consult with yourself to find out what those values are or what they should be, say, in the course of a single life? I mean, you know, it's difficult to organize your own personal relationship, like one relationship in the course of your life, let alone to try to imagine that out of whole cloth you could construct an ethos that would be psychologically and socially stabilizing and last over the long run. It's like, and of course, Marx, people like that, the people who reduce human motivation to a single axis, they had the intellectual hubris to imagine that they could do that. Postmodernists are a good example of that as well.